Hi, class. I hope the first week of summer school has been going well for you. I know it's a lot of material to work through, um, and that the class is going at a fast pace. And also, I'd like to apologize for having to post these lectures late because, as I mentioned before, a number of lectures were uh, somehow lost in the process of transferring them over to a new class. But be that as it may, that's not your issue. That's for me to take care of, and so that's why I'm giving you a couple of lectures uh, to about 3 or 4 more lectures in order to help make sense of the written material. Now today I'm going to be talking about material from chapters 5 through 8 in your main textbook of People and Nation. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is the period going from, say, 1756 until about 1823. Basically, this is the period beginning that where we see the beginning of the 7 Years' War, and it goes on until the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And so we're looking at a period of about 67 years, a pretty long period. I mean, most people these days live longer than 67 years, but 67 years, even if you're 100 years old, that's more than 2/3 of your life. So we're talking about a pretty long period relative to a human life. But it's useful to think of that in terms of a human life, because you could very easily have somebody who was, say, 10 years old in 1756 who was still around in 1823. So a person, who managed to live at 85, if a person died at the age of 85 in 1824, for instance, that person would have lived through the colonial period and would have made it into the first several decades of an independent United States. And so they would have seen a lot of changes, during their lifetime. And that's what I want you all to think about. Now, the thing to understand is that in 1756, when the 7 Year War starts, the American colonies are doing well. The American colonies are along the Atlantic seaboard, going from what is modern day Maine down to South Georgia. And so, that's a long stretch of coastline, about 1,500 miles of coastline. And the American colonies are very well integrated into the British Empire. They produce a number of goods. I mean, the people in the North, for instance, are producing, they harvest the forest, they produce materials that can be used for ships. You have people engaged in large-scale production of food, particularly in the middle colonies, like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. People are growing a lot of food that could be sold to the Caribbean, that could be sold to other areas that were important for the functioning of the British Empire. And also, we see that the South, in particular, South Carolina and Georgia, were producers of rice, which meant that they were very, very important for the Caribbean economies. And so we have to understand that, Britain was part, the Atlantic colonies, which would eventually become the 13 original colonies and then would become the United States, that, you have to see them within the function of the British Empire. They were not, the American colonies were not the richest areas. The richest areas in the British Empire were the Caribbean, which produced sugar, and were also India, which produced spice, tea, a whole bunch of other really valuable things. The function of what became America was largely of a secondary economic nature. But it was still very important. And really, what's crucial to understand for the colonies themselves is that the people who managed to be successful in the colonies were doing quite well. There were a number of very well-to-do people in the colonies, people who had a significant amount of money, and people who were used to being independent. Now, this is a significant thing to understand here is that, remember, the first successful American colony, the Jamestown colony, Virginia, was founded in 1607. And the 7 Years' War starts in 1756. And so this means that you have a period of 149 years, a very long period of time, in which the American colonies, the colonies that would form the foundation of the United States, they were used to a great deal of autonomy. They acknowledged that they were part of the British Empire. They were loyal to the crown. They saw themselves as citizens of Great Britain. But they had relatively little direct contact from Britain. And importantly, from their standpoint, the British did not have a heavy hand in their daily ruling. I mean, each colony had British governors. You had British soldiers that were there. But each colony had a local legislature. Cities had their governments, and the great majority of day-to-day governing was of a local nature. And so this is where things change. Now, it's important to understand that, really throughout the development of modern Europe, really going back to the 14th century, Britain's primary rival in Europe had been France. And that continued as colonization grew. Both countries, actively pursued the development of colonies. And we see that as colonies developed, the rivalry between Britain and France continued to grow. And, if you all have been looking in your book, you see that, in the 18th century, the French controlled what nowadays is Canada. They control, a good bit of Canada. They controlled the area of Quebec. And also, the French controlled the interior of North America. I mean, the French had a lot of backcountry traders who worked for them. And the French controlled territory, along the Mississippi River. I mean, this area where we are here, for instance, Cahokia was started originally as a trading post for the French. Of course, St. Louis. Of course, I mean, if you look at St. Louis, the St. Louis area, places like Crèvecoeur, any number of other places, have French names, and that's because it was initially run by the French. And of course, this went all the way down the Mississippi to New Orleans, of course, and Louisiana, of course, very much to this day has a significant French flavor to it. And so the point to be made is that you have a significant rivalry between the British and the French, and and the North American component of that rivalry is very strong. And so ultimately, the British look at the French. They, like I said, the French were in a very strong position, in the central part of, what nowadays we would call the American Midwest. Along the Mississippi River Valley, the French were very strong in the Great Lakes. Even though the Ohio River Valley was part of British territory, I mean, this was a very, very, very sparsely populated territory, at least in terms of white residency. I mean, the overwhelming majority of people who lived in that area were Native Americans. And so you had a significant French presence, even along the Ohio River. Once you got on the west side of the Appalachians, the French just simply had a much stronger presence than the British. And so what we see with the 7 Years' War is that starting in 1756, the British and the French go into a struggle, what is essentially a world war. I mean, we talk about, one of the reasons why I like to refer to the war as the 7 Years' War instead of the French and Indian War is that, if we use the term French and Indian War, it really tends to focus only on North America. But the 7 Years' War was essentially a world war. The British and the French, they fought each other in North America. They fought each other in the Caribbean. They fought each other in West Africa. They fought each other in India. They fought each other in Southeast Asia. And so therefore, it's important, I like the term 7 Years' War because it really emphasizes that this was a worldwide struggle between the British and the French over who was going to control the colonial world. At this time, European powers, were far and away the strongest powers in the world. And the French and the British were the two strongest European countries. And so the 7 Years' War was a struggle over who was going to control this territory, and who was going to control the world. And so it starts in 1756. And, initially the war doesn't go all that well. I mean, the British have, the French have a stronger presence, as I said earlier, in the interior of the Americas. And the British don't have a particularly strong military presence. And the other thing, too, is that, as I said before, from 1607 to 1756, when the war starts, the American colonies, were very used to being autonomous. They weren't united. The colonies were all, primarily concerned with what worked well for them. And as your book mentions, there really was not a notion of patriotism among many of the colonial people. They had been used to trading with whomever they wanted to trade, including the French. And so what we see is that, even once the war starts, I tell you, I keep turning my head sometimes because it's just kind of odd sometimes how I look in relation to the camera. Excuse me for getting off topic for a minute. So if you see me turning my head around a lot, I'm not crazy. It's just, I'm just trying to get oriented with the camera. But anyway, be that as it may. Excuse me. When the war starts, as I was saying earlier, the British kind of found themselves at a disadvantage. I mean, the French were a lot more organized. The French had a number of very strong treaties, and they had good relations with Native Americans. Because remember, the French tended to have a different colonial structure than the Americans. Than the British. They had far fewer people who settled. And so that meant that Native Americans dealing with the French, had much less they had much less interruption from their day-to-day life than did Native Americans who lived in areas that were dominated by the British. And so, like I said, this gives the French an initial advantage. But as we know, the British would eventually win the war. And so it's important to take a look at what allows the British to win the war. And so let's go back a little bit and let's look in the book and let's take a look at some things here. Now, oh goodness, let me see. Here we go. Let's get back to it now. Now, what we see is that the British began to do better once they changed their policy in the Americas. Now, in particular, we see that the British, who were led by William Pitt, he was a member of Parliament, and he was a minister working under King George II at that time. Now, King George II would eventually pass on, and his grandson, King George III, would take over. But under William Pitt, Pitt began to actively recruit Americans to be much more upfront in the fighting of the war. And this eventually allowed for a more regular source of troops. And it also brought in people who were more used to American conditions. And eventually, the British were able to win a very resounding victory in North America. You know, as the book mentions at the beginning of this chapter, it talks about the British victory in Quebec. And so eventually, by 1763, the war is over. The French have pretty much been kicked out of North America, except for New Orleans. And the British find themselves in a very commanding position. Now, this is one of those situations, this is one of the situations in history where things take a very unexpected turn. Because, you know, people who were alive in 1763, if you were a colonist in 1763, if you were a member of the British government in 1763, you would have had every reason to think that defeating the French in the 7 Years' War would have been nothing but good news for the North American colonies. I mean, because after all, they've gotten rid of the French. This means that the English-speaking colonists are in a position to expand as deep into North America as they can imagine, at least up to the Ohio River. I mean, there's nobody there in their way anymore. They're in a much stronger position. However, what we find is within 13 years. Remember, the 7-Year War ends in 1763. By 1776, the American colonies would issue a Declaration of Independence, and they would go to war against Great Britain. And by 1783, Britain and the American colonies would sign a treaty in Paris that would recognize the American colonies as independent. So, you know, within 20 years, a very short period of time, you know, basically the time between, say, 9/11 and where we are right now. I mean, that's almost 19 years. And so, you know, maybe a little bit longer than that. You know, you go from a situation where Britain looks to be in a very, very powerful position in North America. They go to a point where they lose the lower American colonies. I mean, they still keep Canada, but, you know, the area from Maine to Georgia is a much more heavily populated area. And, you know, these are valuable colonies that they lose. And so let's take a look at how this happens. Now, as I said before, the key thing that I really want you all to remember is that from 1607 to 1756, I couldn't remember the year for a minute, the American colonies were very much autonomous. However, in order to win the 7 Years' War, Britain had to put forth a major effort. Because remember, as I said before, the reason I always like to call it the 7 Years' War, not the French and Indian War, is that this was a war that was fought, you know, on several continents. It was fought in Europe, it was fought in North America, it was fought in Africa, and it was fought in Asia. You know, this was a world war. And the thing about war that you can never forget is that war is extremely expensive. You have to move thousands of men. You have to create, especially back in these days, you have to create ships. You have to have munitions. You have to pay people. You have to feed troops. You know, all of this is extremely expensive. And the 7 Years' War is a 7 Years' War. That's a pretty long period of time. That's longer than World War II. It's longer than the American Civil War. It's longer than World War One. And so this is a long war. So it's not a cheap war. And so the bottom line is that once the 7 Years' War is over, the British want to pay for the war. And they look to the colonies. Courtney! Hey, Courtney, can you give me some water, please? I'm trying to get through this lecture. My throat's getting dry. Anyway, students, sorry about that. I just had to pester my youngest kid to give me some water because I have a lot more to talk about, and I don't want to try to cough through the whole lecture. So please excuse that break. But anyway, as I was saying before, the war had to be paid for. And so what we see is that after the war, the government comes up, the British government comes up with a tax. And this tax is known as the Stamp Act. Thank you. There we go. That little bit of water is doing me some good. I think I will be able to talk with a nice voice at least for a while. And so basically the notion of the Stamp Act was that in any transaction requiring written documents, the paper had to have a stamp from the British government to show that taxes had been paid on it. Now, as your book mentions, this is a significant act because it means that people who are business people, people who own businesses, people who have property, they have to buy stamp paper from the government in order to do business. And as the book also mentions, the tax had to be paid in actual specie or coin. And this is significant because, this is a colonial situation. And a lot of people don't have hard cash. A lot of business was done in barter. A lot of economic transactions were done in kind. And so anything that actually required actual money was something that required a good bit of sacrifice on the part of the people who had to come up with the money. And so there was a great deal of resentment to this. And so what we see is that a lot of people very early on start to criticize this. I mean, like, for instance, your book mentions James Otis, who put out a pamphlet, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, in which he argues that, the Americans, were loyal members of the British society, but he felt the law was not just, and felt that, they should have some impact on it. That Americans should have some say in what they do. Now, the interesting thing about Otis is that Otis, he took the argument a step further than a lot of early colonists were willing to do, and that he argued that, slavery itself was a natural extension of the process by which colonists would deny their rights, and that, ultimately, if the British colonists want to be really fair-minded, they would not only demand their own rights, but they would also give rights to all humans, in the colonies, which would include slaves. Now, obviously, he's literally 100 years ahead of his time because the Emancipation Proclamation comes in 1863, and he's writing in 1763. But the point to be made is that at the very beginning of the American Revolution, 13 years before you have a Declaration of Independence, there are intellectuals in America who look at their demands for freedom and see that there is kind of a fundamental disconnect between people asking for freedom, while at the same time they have an economy that is so heavily reliant on slave labor and slave trading. But anyway, that's kind of getting ahead of things. But, the book mentions that. And it is important to mention because slavery not only is the foundation of the American economy, but As America gains its independence, slavery simultaneously is a source of economic growth and source of tension, and eventually becomes a spark that leads to the bloodiest war in American history so far. Hopefully we don't have a bloodier one, but so far in the 230 some years of American independence, I'm referring to the Constitution, not Declaration of Independence. The U.S. Civil War has been the bloodiest war, and that war has its origins in slavery. But anyway, what we see is that, other colonialists like Patrick Henry, they speak out against the Stamp Act. And what we see is that between 1763 and 1776, a culture of both civil disobedience and also a culture of destruction and looting. And, this is really interesting because, in America right now, for the past week, we've had issues with looting in America. People who have political criticism, committing acts of vandalism and looting against businesses. And, a number of those people have mentioned that, if you look at the very origins of American history, a political activist attacked and looted businesses and attacked and looted government offices of people who carried out policies they didn't like. And so therefore, from that standpoint, you can kind of make an argument that what's going on in America right now is something that, whether people like it or not, is something that's a very fundamentally American kind of thing. Where people protest and criticize the government, and then you have a number of people who take extra legal or illegal action and attack property and buildings of people who represent policy they don't like. Now, I'm not trying to say what's happening now is good or that people have to approve of those things, but I think it is important to understand that the kind of activity that people saw last week or this week is not without historical precedent. But anyway, to get back to what we are talking about here, of course, we have a situation in which there's a gradual slide towards war. And eventually by 1776, you do have conflict breaking out between Britain and the American colonies. Now, it's important to understand that the Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence, was a very big gamble for the leadership in America. Because from the British standpoint, these people were disloyal subjects. They were insurrectionists. And they would be treated very harshly. As a matter of fact, Benjamin Franklin was very famous for the quote he had where he said, we all have to hang together or we will hang separately. Which referred to the fact that as people fighting against the British government, they would be seen as traitors. And if captured, they would be put to death. Now, the interesting thing about the war is that, once again, although the American colonies were united in their dislike of Britain, at least a lot of them were. Now, a big proportion of Americans still supported Britain. And, if you look at Canada right now, the country to the north of us where people have accents that sound almost American. Now, the reason they sound almost American is that a whole lot of those people were Americans. But they were loyal to Britain and they went north, when the war ended. And so, that's why America and Canada are so similar because, the populations of both countries, to a large degree spring from the same source. But the bottom line is that America comes into the war, and really kind of like the 7 Years' War, America comes into the war not particularly well prepared, but eventually is able to cobble together a structure that allows them to survive. And also another thing that's really important for the American Revolution is that America benefits a great deal from the assistance of the French. The French at this time, during the American Revolution, the French are led by Louis the 15th, and he is very happy to send money to America in order to get revenge for France losing the 7 Years' War. And so, we could never underestimate the degree to which the French helped the Americans. The French give a lot of money. A matter of fact, even at the very end of the war, when General Cornwallis surrenders to Washington at the Battle of Yorktown in 1783, it's the French fleet that blocks in the British and forces them to surrender. And so, therefore, America, it's important to understand that the American leadership did pull together and were effective in fighting. But they were greatly aided, by military assistance from France. And so what we see is that by 1783, America signs the Treaty of Paris, and the American colonies are independent. Now, American independence, at least early on, was a good example of the old saying that, you should be careful what you ask for. Because as I said at the beginning of this lecture, it's important to understand that, the American colonies were a significant part of the British Empire. These colonists, the business class had become quite well-to-do. Functioning within the British Empire, supplying the colonies with material that they needed to function, supplying especially the Caribbean colonies with material they needed to survive. But once the American colonies gained their independence, this meant the British were like, well, you all wanted independence. You didn't want anything to the British Empire. You all are not getting access to British colonial markets like you did when you were part of the empire. You're just not going to get it. And so this meant that American business people had to find new strategies. Now, a lot of American business people still continue to do business with the colonies, but they could not do so legally. This meant that a lot of Americans, engaged in smuggling. Now, it just so happens that American businessmen were already good at smuggling because, like I said, if you've been reading the book, you know that one of the things that happened during the 7 Years' War is that American businessmen kept smuggling stuff to the French, even though they were at war with them, because, they were more interested in getting paid than helping Britain win the war effort. And so we see that attitude continuing, once America gets its independence. However, the Americans also begin to reach out into other markets. They begin to go into other areas. One of the things that, like my original area of specialty is Africa. And one of the interesting things that happens, for instance, is that you see the Americans going more into Africa, in particular, like places in East Africa, by the early 1800s. America is off the coast of what nowadays is Tanzania and is doing business on the island of Zanzibar, with the government there. And also, as your book mentions, too, America is in North Africa. Like by 1801, America is fighting a war with the Barbary Pirates. Now, the Barbary Pirates are rulers in what nowadays is Algeria. And, going back, about 500 or 600 years, there had been a tradition in the Caribbean of Mediterranean pirates coming out of the southern part of the Mediterranean, the North African coast, capturing people and, carrying them to North Africa, making people pay ransoms or enslaving people and putting them to work in North Africa. And so the American government found themselves in a situation where American shipping was attacked by the North African government. And by the way, the North African government this time was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was based in what nowadays is Turkey. And, the government in 1801 ends up fighting a short war in Algeria. Like for instance, when the Marines sing the songs from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Tripoli, of course, is in North Africa. They're referring to the Barbary Pirates. Now, the other thing that's really significant during this time is that, in the late 1700s, going into the early 1800s, there is increasing tension once again between Britain and France. As I said before, the French had helped the Americans gain their independence. But this came at a great cost for France, because France, just like Britain ran up a lot of money beating the French, the French ran up a lot of money beating the British. And so this meant that Louis XVI, the son of the guy who had invested the money in beating the British, in the American War of Independence, he had to pay the bill for it. And so therefore he was raising taxes and not taking care of the French people. And so this meant that by 1789, you have the French Revolution, which, for about 6 years, we see the destruction of the French nobility. But by the end of the 18th century, we see the Corsican general, Napoleon Bonaparte, taking over. And he's a very successful general. And so what we see is that by the early 1800s, you have military hostilities between the British and the French. And this leads us to a situation that's very significant. Now, I'm going to skip and go all the way up to chapter 8. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't look at chapters 6 and 7. Especially, I would argue that you need to look at, like, for instance, where they discuss the Articles of the Confederation. This is something you should read on your own in the book. You should look at discussions of the Articles of Confederation, the first government that was created in America after independence. You should also make it a point to look at discussions of the Constitution. Because the constitutional system, of course, that's the system of government that ends up, being the one that we still have to this day. That's a federal constitution that has certain powers for the states, certain powers for the federal government. And, that's the system that we still have. And we'll be talking about that more in other periods. Now, I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm pretty sure y'all don't want to listen to me talk for like an hour and 10 minutes. And so I'm going to not talk about that. But I do want to switch the gears and talk a bit about, go to chapter 8, and talk about what happens in 1807. And let me get up here. There we go. Turn some pages. Let me get past that. And let's see. Oh, yeah, here we go. I'm just about there now. Now, what I want you all to think about, this, like I said, this is a situation in 1807 where you have, like I said, by this time, Britain and France are fighting again. And what we see is that the British, they're trying to get every sailor they can to help them fight against the Napoleon, who's a great general. And so you have a situation, and this is in your book on page 221, where it talks about, in June of 1807, a ship, the USS Chesapeake, was sailing out of Norfolk for the Mediterranean when it was stopped by the British ship, the Leopard. Now, the British, they come up against the American ship, and they demand to board the ship because they believe that they have some deserters who have signed up with the American Navy. The Americans are like, no, you have no right to come into our ship. We're we're a ship of an independent nation. You don't have a right to come onto the ship and look for anybody. Anybody here is with us. Now, the British attack the Chesapeake. They fight the sailors. They defeat them. They take four American sailors. Uh, some of them are citizens, and they're deserters. They take them. They hang one for being a deserter. And so this, of course, is a massive violation of American sovereignty. But America at the time is not strong enough to fight the British. And so what we see is that the American government under Madison, excuse me, not Madison, but the American government under Jefferson imposed an embargo on Britain, saying, look, we refuse to do business with Britain. And so we see that America and Britain, even though America is an independent country, America is a much weaker country, and the British really are not respecting American independence. And this, of course, would eventually culminate in the War of 1812. Basically, as I said before, the conflict between Napoleon and the British is still continuing. Now, the Americans are still trying to maintain their economic independence. And so we see the whole question of the British attacking American shipping or impressing American sailors. Now, impressment means that they go aboard ship and they force people to fight for the British, to join the British Navy. And so this eventually results in a war that goes on between 1812 to 1814. Now, it's important to understand that the War of 1812 is a major American conflict. But for the British, the War of 1812 is kind of a secondary conflict, because, as I said before, the most important conflict for the British at this time is the war that they are fighting with the French. They're fighting with Napoleon. But the War of 1812 is very significant because it exposes American weakness. I mean, the British invade America, and, really they pound America. The British go into Washington, D.C., they burn down the American Capitol. The Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key when the British came into Baltimore and bombed Baltimore. And the British, like they did during the Revolutionary War, cut deals with slaves. You remember, the American population in 1790, 1 out of every 5 people in America was a slave. And so the British, when they came in and offered freedom to slaves, this was something that had the power to really undermine the American system. Now, the thing that's really interesting about America is that in the period of independence, the early period of independence, there was a significant decline in slavery in the northern states. And so there was an increasingly free black population, but in the South, slavery was becoming more and more important, especially once the cotton gin was invented. And, there was now technology that allowed Southerners to really take advantage of cotton, which gave America a really important import crop, that could be sent to Britain. And also it became the foundation of the textile economy in the North. And so the bottom line is that, Britain, if Britain had really wanted to, Britain could have defeated America in all likelihood in the War of 1812. America does manage to hold on and keep its independence. The irony, of course, is that, the really big battle that America won, the Battle of New Orleans, was a battle that was actually fought. By this time, New Orleans had become a Spanish territory. And then by 1803, America had bought the Louisiana territory from the French because, as I said before, the battle between France and Britain, really affected America at this time. And America is able to buy the Louisiana territory because the French had been defeated in Haiti. Haiti was the most valuable colony that the French had. And once Napoleon loses Haiti, then the Louisiana Territory really isn't worth that much anymore. And so when Jefferson's willing to give Napoleon, $3 or $4 million, $3 million or so for Louisiana Territory, Napoleon's like, hey, yeah, you can have it, man. Give me the money. And so the point to be made is that, it's kind of a side point, but I think it's a very important point that to have American history in perspective at this time is that America's a pretty weak country. And that a lot of what we see going on in America is not so much because America is all that big and rough and tough. It's America is catching breaks in one way or another because of conflict between Britain and France. Those are the two major countries. And America is really kind of benefiting, the American leadership is able to benefit time and again between conflicts between those countries. But anyway, to get back to the War of 1812, by 1814, when the war is over, America wins the war, but America's in a fairly weak position still. Like I said, the British could have taken America, but it's not worth it for them at that time. Now, what we will see is that America is going to continue to grow. It will continue to get population. And America, by the time you get to the middle part of the 19th century, is becoming a very big country, a very powerful country. Now, throughout the 19th century, America does not have a particularly big army. And, America basically benefits from the fact that it's not next to Europe. It's off between two oceans. And America can pretty much concentrate on getting control of the area that would become the lower 48 states and, also Alaska and Hawaii. It's really not until the very end of the 19th century that the American military starts to develop a significant international capacity. So therefore, after the War of 1812, America is pretty much able to it's left to itself and can kind of grow at kind of a fast pace, but not really have to deal with a lot of major power military pressure. Now, having said that, America was very much interested in controlling its territories, and so one of the things that we see happening is that in 1823, President Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine, in which he says that America would not take kindly to any Europeans coming into American territories. Now, when I say American territories, I mean territory in the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. Latin America is, not so much the United States, but Latin America. Now, as I said before, America was not a strong country in 1823. It was a small country. But America is able to put out the Monroe Doctrine because the British, after Napoleon has been defeated, you have a major conference in Vienna, a conference in Vienna, and the British, along with other Europeans, develop what becomes known as the Council of Europe. And a lot of these people, they want to shut down what's going on in Latin America because they see it as revolutionary activity. But the British won't let them do it because they're making money there. And so really it's the British who allow Latin America to keep its independence. But America, through the Monroe Doctrine, kind of puts a word in for themselves. But America really does not have the military capability to really enforce it at this time. Now, at the end of the 19th century, once you start getting into the 1870s, 1880s, and so on, America becomes much stronger, especially after the Spanish-American War, and America is able to actually do what it says it wants to do. But I think it's really important to understand that the first couple of generations of American independence, America was a weak country. America had a lot of potential. There was a lot of economic activity, but America was not a major power. And America is largely able to survive because of some good luck and really the fact that, to a certain degree, retaking America probably wasn't worth it for Britain. And so that's just something to keep in perspective when we talk about America at this time. Well, anyway, class, I hope that this lecture is helpful to you. I'll be posting a few more this week to help you with other uh, sections in the book. So the readings will make sense to you. And you all have a good week, and I hope this is useful to you. See you later.